so that there is this recognition that we actually influence each other with our vagal tone. Dr. Porges has this term that he speaks about sometimes about a super co-regulator. So he talks a lot about co-regulation, that is the phrase that basically represents how one person's vagal tone can actually be a regulating force for another person. Right. And that the super co-regulator is someone who basically might walk into a room or might, lead a group, and that their nervous system is very regulating for large groups of people. I have some theories in myself about the kind of downside of super co-regulation, which to me, a lot of individuals who've grown up with trauma actually become the super co-regulator for their family. Because they've grown up in a dysregulating environment and they had to rely on their own internal system for regulation because there was no external regulator. And as a result, sometimes that is a very exhaustive function to be a co-regulator for others when it's not balanced with being on the receiving end of being nourished by other people's capacity to co-regulate you, right? And so anyway, I could go on a tangent there, but I've spent a lot of time on this particular side and I've got some more to get through. So we might come back to that during Q&A later if some of you have questions about it. So parasympathetic, we've got the newer circuit, the older circuit, which as you can see has some shared neurology all the way up into the face. If you think about someone that has gone into either a flattened affect or a social disconnect, sometimes that dorsal vagal will show up in a dullness in the eyes, that dorsal vagal will show up in a dullness of the eyes, or a flatness across the face in that context of not being safe. And in contrast, when we're in the social engagement system, we'll see a sparkle in the eyes, there's a natural smile, the voice tone has more prosody or more kind of up and down sing-song quality. The last piece that I'll say on this slide is about the enteric nervous system, which is our kind of gut brain or second brain. And there's so much research out there about the relationship between anxiety, stress, dysbiosis or digestive system imbalances, microbiome, and how all of that can worsen anxiety, depression, and PTSD symptoms. And the vagus nerve plays a key aspect in that because it's communicating the gut brain to the brainstem and vice versa. So we think about that bidirectional communication highway, and that primarily the communication is going body to brain in that upward direction or afferent direction. So about 80% of the vagal fibers are communicating in the upward direction. All right. So there was a very pivotal study that brought together yoga and polyvagal theory, and Marlisa Sullivan and others, including Dr. Porges, wrote an article together that looked at yogic philosophy and nervous system states. And within yogic philosophy, there is, without going into great depth, but basically there's this understanding that we have 3 states of matter, that those 3 states of matter can be kind of sattvic, that are in this state of kind of equilibrium and balance. We might think in Goldilocks terms here, that's just right? It's not too hot, it's not too cold. It's that ventral vagal complex of lightness and clarity and joy and buoyancy and understanding and balance. And that the other 2 gunas are kind of representational of times when we go out of balance, right? Sometimes we go too hot, if you want to think Goldilocks here, the rajasic quality in which it's, kind of restless, anxious, aggressive. It will mobilize us in some way. It's got movement to it. And they're likening this to the sympathetic nervous system. Now, one of the key aspects of polyvagal theory is that there's also ways that we can kind of blend nervous system states, right? Like it took out that dichotomous view of sympathetic being bad and parasympathetic being good. So now we can kind of keep in mind, in what ways might our sympathetic nervous system actually be really helpful so long as it can be blended with a bit of that sattva or a little bit of that social engagement system? In what ways might mobilization help us be inspired or creative, motivated, create positive change in the world? Go climb a mountain, whatever is your thing, right? Practice yoga on your mat and feel like you really wanted an energizing practice. So there's ways to work with that rajasic quality by bringing in our ventral vagal complex, our social engagement system. And on the kind of other side of this continuum, if we think about times in which we might feel kind of immobilized or collapsed or low energy, dull, numbness, this would be a tamasic quality. And in our Goldilocks terms, it's too cold, right? So that we don't have enough energy. Sometimes I think about these three states like a mountain lake, right? The sattva is this, very clear lake that just allows for a very calm reflection of ourselves and the world. And that the rajasic would be one of those days where there's like a choppiness and it blurs, it doesn't have that clear reflection and there's a lot of action in the lake. And the tamasic quality is one of those really hot summer days, right? It's been hot for months and now there's kind of like algae growing on top of the lake. And again, it's going to cloud our view, but it has a stagnancy to it. And so we know that, right? We all have these different states. There's nothing wrong with any of your nervous system states, right? We're all going to touch these various states. It's how do we take care of ourselves when we're there? I know that there is a hand up there. Is it Dara? I just want to let you know that we're going to take questions towards the end. Oh, you're like, no, didn't mean that. No worries. Thank you. So, just allowing yourself to kind of recognize there isn't a good or bad nervous system state. We're not here to judge, right? It's really about fine-tuning your nervous system. Once again, if you're starting to feel some of that dullness or numbness or maybe some dissociation or some depression, how can we bring sattva in? How could we bring compassion right into that state? How can we bring softness or understanding in which case the tamasic quality can actually bring stability, really healthy, brilliant stillness, right? Spaciousness or groundedness. In some ways, we really need that kind of dorsal vagal and ventral vagal complex in combination to facilitate meditation, right? It allows us to rest into stillness optimally, right? Where we're not falling asleep, right? We're actually really staying present with that like blissful state of stillness that can be accessed, that expanded consciousness. So I'll just weave in briefly here the polyvagal ladder. Deb Dana, who also teaches with Polyvagal Institute, and I teach with them as well, and kind of looking at the kind of ways to recognize your own nervous system states and asking yourself, what are the people, the places, or the practices that help you to feel safe and connected? Right? What helps you access ventral vagal engagement? And if you're in your sympathetic nervous system, what tends to trigger that? What are the people, places, situations that might bring up fear or panic or overwhelm? And if you're feeling some of that shakiness or jitteriness or intensity, whatever you want to call it, what helps you resource yourself when you're there? And in contrast, if you're feeling that dorsal vagal shutdown, right, what would bring that up? What tends to trigger feelings of helplessness or collapse in you? And what would help you resource yourself there? And Deb Dana offers this image of kind of climbing the ladder. So sometimes if we're feeling shut down, we might actually bring a little bit of that sympathetic mobilization in to climb the ladder back up through nervous system states to access the ventral vagal. Do we always need to climb the ladder in order to find balance? No. We can actually bring sufficient orientation to safety to that experience of helplessness or collapse and actually find that hybrid state or that sweet blend right there. So kind of knowing yourself and what works for your nervous system. This term safe mobilization and safe immobilization comes from one of Deb Dana's books about applying polyvagal theory to therapy. It is quite applicable to yoga as well. How do we safely mobilize on the yoga mat through play and movement? And, what allows you to explore with curiosity? What allows you to initiate movement, right? And dance and create, reaching, stretching, finding instinctual movements, shaking something off, and what facilitates maybe some release. And then also what helps us safely immobilize, relax, rest, savor something, receive, digest, maybe sleeping well at night being a great sign that you can safely immobilize, meditation, yoga nidra, and spiritual states. So I could spend lots of time on this slide, which I won't, but I'm pretty geeky about things like interoception and the role that proprioception plays on our yoga mat. These are our sensory systems. External senses, our five senses, are exteroception. So our sensory awareness of the space around us through our eyes and ears and sense of taste and touch and smell. Interoception is the internal sensory awareness, might be temperature, hunger, thirst, areas of contraction in the body, areas of expansion, and it gives information about your emotions. Right? And then proprioception, think of that as your body's GPS system. It's awareness about your body in space, is related to gravity. So when you're sitting down, you know where the chair is behind you and you can orient yourself in space. And trauma tends to interfere with all of this, right? It can amplify our sensory system, leading to sensory processing challenges. It can intensify interoceptive feedback in a way that can feel overwhelming, or it can dial down interoceptive feedback in a way that leads us to feel numb or disconnected from our body. And it can interfere with our proprioceptive awareness, leading us to be more clumsy or difficulty coordinating. I'm reaching for the glass, but I knock it off the table because I'm not quite as aware of my body in space. And yoga helps with all of this, right? Just keep tying it in, right? One more kind of polyvagal term here that will be kind of a valuable anchor for our shared language is the term of neuroception. And I liken this in the yoga mat to a process of self-discovery. But neuroception is the way that our nervous system is constantly detecting whether we're safe, whether there's danger, whether there's a life threat. And it does this without conscious awareness. Your nervous system is going to scan a room, scan the voice tone, scan the facial expression, and basically is just doing this to help keep you safe. Great. We need that. And that there are, that there are ways in which we can kind of get that off gauge. Like we can't quite tell. Sometimes we get false positives, sometimes we get false negatives, right? So sometimes we're responding to a threat, whether it's in your body or your external environment or your relationships, and we're responding as if there's a threat, but there's actually no threat. Right? But it's a historical remembrance, or maybe it's your body is cueing off of a color, even though currently there's no current threat, but that color reminded you of a time historically where there was something scary happened or a threat happened, right? Or a certain smell. I think a lot of us can relate to that with certain smells. Right. So sometimes those sensory cues can lead to those false positives. Or, a classic example, a car backfires, we jump, we startle. But if you had been in active combat, that might bring you back to, a terrifying moment, and your body, next thing you know, you're crouched on the ground, right? And so kind of looking at how are we responding and how do we actually fine tune neuroceptive awareness by bringing conscious perception to these neuroceptive cues so that I can actually notice the cues in my own mind, body, breath, emotions, and energy. And this allows for discernment. Is the response that I'm having accurate?